Welcome back, everybody. In this lesson, we are going to look at how to modify a request payload on the fly. In the last lesson, we did look at a basic version of request modification. What we did was a basic replacement of a value inside a placeholder string. So if you look at this, uh, we had this title, body, and user ID as the placeholder string inside angle brackets. And for each instance of the input data, we would replace the corresponding value inside that placeholder. So it was a basic form of request modification. In this lesson, what we are going to look at is something called as embedded expression. It is a type of payload templating approach in karate. We are also going to look at how to add new attributes or a key value pair inside a payload on the fly, or even how to delete an attribute or key value pair inside a payload. So let's get started. So we are still going to be working with the post API. Let me start off by creating a new feature file. Let me call it as request. Let's say modify dot feature, and let me, because I'm going to be working with the post API, let me start off by copying the feature and the scenario. Let's say let's copy this scenario outline and let me paste it over here. All right, let me name this as modify requests on the fly. Background initialize stuff is okay, right? And in this case, in the scenario outline, the first scenario that I'm going to test is test the embedded expression. So let me call it as embedded expression. Let's say let me be really unimaginative here. And okay, we are not working with uh, the replacement sort of a thing that we did last time. We will be working with embedded expressions. So what is an embedded expression? So if you look at the documentation on karate docs, uh, it shows there are some rules for embedded expressions. First of all, this is what is an embedded expression. The thing that starts with a hash, then the brackets, and then the enclosing quotes. This is an embedded expression. And there are a few rules. They only work with JSON. They only work on the right hand side of def, match, and configure. And they can you can read it from JSON or XML file. And more importantly, it starts with hash and these brackets, right? So this is an embedded expression, which is a way of saying it's a template. It's not the exact request just yet, but just before the request is formed, the template will be fulfilled. You're going to evaluate the values, and then the values will get assigned inside this template. So in my case, uh, let's say we have a template called as let's say rqst, right? And let's define it as what do we have? User ID. I want to keep the same things here: user ID, and then we have the body, and then we have the title, right? uh, as we saw in the documentation, these needs to be embedded expressions, right? So all I will do here is I will say that this is a user ID. And similarly, let me copy paste this for body and title as well. So this is the body and this is the title. Names. So we have an embedded expression, and what we want to do here is we want to say that use this definition. Okay, so this is a definition. We're defining a variable here called as rqst, which is an embedded expression. and we want to use this expression for our request, right? So, and when the request is formed, we evaluate, we use the templatized attributes here and replace it with the values which are there in examples. And it works the same way as we had seen last time with the placeholder strings, right? So let me just go ahead and run this test, and let's see what happened. And if you see here, it failed, and the reason it says is the string does not match the number. So the problem here is with embedded expression, inside examples, the columns that we use inside examples, these will be evaluated to string by default. If you want them to be evaluated as a JavaScript object, for instance, in this user, in case of user ID, we want it to be a number. But if we use the default column names here, it will be evaluated to string. It is fine for title and body because we want it to be string in any case, but user ID, if we expect it to be a number. So in that case, with embedded expression, we want to use an exclamation mark over here. So in this case, it will be treated as a JavaScript data type. In this case, it will be treated as number. Let me run this now, and all three scenarios have passed, right? So let me look at the last data point here. So the request was, it's a post request, user ID 3, body 3, title 3 as expected. And then we match the response by replacing. So if you look at the response assertion, we have used the placeholder strings as we had done last time. You could also use the embedded expression in the response as well. So it could be a mix and match of both. So for instance, if we do this and run it again, uh, you should see all three cases still passing. There you go. All right. Uh, the good part of embedded expression is, you can treat, uh, uh, you're not bound to use the basic data types, the primitive data types, but you could also use JSON object in the examples column. For instance, if I were to use this, let me use the second scenario here, and let me call this as an embedded expression 2, for instance. And in this case, what I want to use is, I don't want to use multiple columns, uh, but I want to use user as one JSON object, and I still want to evaluate it as a JSON data type. So I'll still keep the exclamation mark. But what I'm saying here is, let the user ID be 1, title be, let's say, title 1, and body be body 1. And let me also create another data point and call this as body 2, title 2, and user ID 2, right? In this case, how would I use this? In this case, I cannot just use uh, user ID over here, right? In this case, let me use another request. Let me call this as request 1, for instance, and you use request 1 in this scenario. In this case, however, I cannot use user ID directly. It's an attribute inside the user object. So all I will do here is, I'll say user.user ID, and same thing for the body and the title, right? So everything else remains the same, because now this is not a simple data type. This is not a simple string or integer anymore. It's a JSON object whose name or whose key is user. I can use it as user.user ID, right? So that's what I've done here. And similarly, I will have to replace it in the uh, response assertion as well, right? For instance, in case of title, has to be uh, this dot title, user dot title. In case of body, it needs to be user dot body. Okay. let ID be a number because it is generated on the server, and in case of user ID, needs to be user.id. I think we are good here. Let me run this use case now and see what's going on. And if you see, there were two test cases, both of them passed. Let's quickly verify the last data point here. Oh no, something has gone wrong. Why is that? Because if you see here, I was expecting uh, user ID to be 1 and 2, but it has said null. Uh, what could be the reason? Hash and user, right? Oh, I didn't quotes over here because with JSON object, and this I've spelled it wrong. Body, and it should be a string. There you go. With JSON object, you are allowed to not put quotes around the key, but around you should still be putting quotes around the value. Let me run this and see. There you go. Both of them passed. Let me look at the request, and there you go. You have user ID 2, body 2, and title 2, and this coming up nicely. Uh, the next test that we are going to look at is uh, for instance, in this request, we are passing in three key value pairs, right? The user ID, body, and title. What if we wanted to pass in another attribute or another key value pair inside the request payload, but you did not want to change the template itself? So this is the generic template that you wanted to use. You did not want to change anything in here, but on the fly, on the test itself, in the scenario itself, you wanted to add an attribute to the request payload before it is sent out. So let me write a test case, uh, and let me say, let's call this test case as add an attribute on the fly, right? So rest all the things remains the same. You're still using request one, but just before you set it to request, what you're trying to do here is you want to add uh, let's say, an hashtag to the post uh, that goes out, right? So right now for a post request, you have this user ID, title, and body in the payload, but you also want to set an hashtag when you write a post, right? So for instance, what you're really saying here is for request one, you want to add another key called as hashtag, and you want to set it as uh, let's say database, right? uh, let's say all the posts that you're going to write are related to databases. So this is a common hashtag that you want to include for every post that gets created, but you don't really want to use it in the template itself. So just doing this isn't enough. All you have to use is a set keyword. So what you're doing here is you're using the set, and you're using the request object, and then defining an attribute called hashtag and setting its value to database. If hashtag exists, it will update its value. If the hashtag does not exist, which in our case does not exist in request one, it will create a hashtag with the value set to database, right? And now if we run, uh, you I don't know why this failed. Oh, I think I missed an equal sign here. So if I run now, it should still fail, however, but for a different reason. Uh, See now, if I look at the last request, uh, you can see that a hashtag attribute was added in the payload. So our code did work, but what failed was the assertion, because we did not have because in the response it returned an hashtag attribute, the new attribute that we added, but our assertion failed because we did not have hashtag in our assertion. So one way to do that is, of course, you can say hashtag and that it's a string. You can do it this way, just like the way we have done. Other way to do it is, let's say if this is optional thing, you don't necessarily want to, you're okay if the hashtag isn't present in the response. The way to do that, or for optional assertion, is double hashes, right? So if you do this and run it, uh, if you run it now, both tests have passed. And if you um, what this essentially does is, even if it is present or not present, it will just, it's an optional. So if it is present, it won't complain, but if it is not, it won't complain also. So for instance, let me say if I didn't do this and ran this code again, it should still pass because the hashtag assertion was an optional assertion, right? So it still passed. All right, let me undo this. uh, Now let's think of a scenario where uh, where we want to conditionally set a particular attribute on the payload, right? What do I mean by that? In this case, at line number 40, we are always setting an attribute on the payload. What if we wanted to do that only when certain condition was met, right? Let me take another scenario over here. Let's say uh, we want to set an hashtag only uh, if the post is by user ID 1, right? If that is our scenario, how would we do that? Let's say user ID 1 is our CEO, and every time CEO posts, we want to set a hashtag as CEO instead of let's say database. How do we do that? But we want to set it only when user ID uh, is 1, right? One way to do that is we define a function, a JavaScript function, which will set hashtag attribute to a desired value, and then we use a conditional logic with using if, and we say that if user id is equal to 1, then call that function and provide the key value pairs, and the javascript function would be called, and we will evaluate it, right? So let's see it in practice. So what we want to do here is, let's comment this out, and what we are trying to do here is, we are trying to do a conditional setting of the payload, right? So let's say if, in brackets, our request object, or the variable containing our request template, is rqst1. If rqst1 dot user id is equal to 1, which means, let's say uh, if it's a post by user id 1, then what we want to do is, we want to call a function. Let's say we call the function set hashtag, and let's say we pass uh, the key, which is hashtag, and then the value, right? So let's say our user id 1 is CEO, and every time user id 1 writes a post, we want to tag it with the word CEO, right? So that's all you need to do over here. All that is left now is to define a function called as set tag, right? And this is how you define a function, right? So let me go over here. You can either write and, or just a star, and say def, that is, you're defining, just like you were defining a variable earlier, just like you had defined a variable, you also define a function. So you say this equals, because this is going to be a multi-line thing, let me do three inverted quotes, and uh, what I'm doing here is function. It takes few arguments, and it does certain things. It takes two arguments, right? The first is, let's say, a key, the second is value, and you know you're going to use the request object. So I'll directly use the request object over here. So what you're saying is when this function is called, essentially you're trying to create a key value pair on this object, right? So all you're doing is setting a hashtag key and setting its value to CEO, and the RQST object is thus modified, which you on the next line set it to the karate request, and I think you should be good over here, right? And we have already set it to optional, so it shouldn't complain. Let's run this. There you go, two tests, both the tests passed. You look at the payload now, there is no uh, hashtag over here because this was user ID 2. Let's go and look at user ID 1. So if you look at user ID 1, there's a new attribute which was conditionally added, with the condition being user ID equal to 1. And that is because this was this evaluated to true for the first data instance, but for the next data instance, it did not go through. So there you go. That is how you do conditionally modify a request in karate. Last thing we are going to look at it is we saw how to add a new key pair or a new attribute inside a payload. How about how to delete an existing key value pair or an attribute from a payload? For instance, uh, let's say we have a use case where we don't want to have a body, right? We just want to test a scenario where a user ID posts just the title and want to verify that it still goes through. In this case, we still want to use the request template, but just that for that particular case, we don't want to use uh, the body. So how do we delete it? Okay, so let me start off by copying uh, the scenario, right? And go over here and we'll call this as delete an attribute on the fly, right? In this case, I'm not interested in setting. Uh, all I want to do here is I want to delete uh, an attribute. I want to delete an attribute uh, body, right? This is the attribute that I want to delete, and that's it. I don't want to assign it to anything. But the way to do that is when you don't want to assign anything, but you still want to run this Java expression, the way to do it is using eval keyword. So eval keyword is something you will use when you don't want to assign the value of an expression to a variable. In this case, we just want to delete the body key from the request object, and then we are setting the request object to RQST. uh, I think in this case now you wouldn't get a body, so let's remove that as well. Now if I run this, uh, hopefully it should pass. Both the tests have passed, and you look at, if you look at the second data instance, there's a user ID and there's a title, right? And the body has been deleted because of this line, right? So that is how you can delete an attribute on the fly. So I hope all this was clear. You are clear with how to modify a request on the fly. How to add an attribute, how to delete an attribute, how to conditionally modify a payload request. Uh, I hope this all made sense. I will see you in the next lesson. Thank you.